The accusation struck Isabel like a physical blow across the face. "You have been meeting Lord Pembroke in secret." The Dowager Duchess spoke the words with such cold certainty that the entire drawing room seemed to freeze. Lady Isabel Ashford, Duchess of Thornfield, stood near the fireplace at 29 years of age, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant chignon that had taken her lady's maid an hour to perfect that morning. Her warm hazel eyes, usually soft with compassion, now reflected barely concealed fear as she faced her husband's family. 3 years of marriage had taught her to maintain composure even when her world was crumbling, and she drew on every lesson now as she clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. Around her, the assembled family members waited for her response with expressions ranging from disgust to cruel satisfaction. Her husband, Duke Sebastian Ashford of Thornfield, sat in the high-backed chair near the window, his tall frame rigid with tension. At 34, he cut an imposing figure with his dark hair and piercing blue eyes that had once made her heart race on their wedding day. Now those same eyes watched her with an expression cold as the winter landscape beyond the glass, his handsome features arranged in the stoic mask he had worn throughout their marriage. He kept his emotions so carefully guarded that Isabel had long ago stopped trying to read them. "Do not insult this family further by denying it," the Dowager Duchess continued, her severe face framed by silver hair that matched the cold gray of her eyes. At 58, Catherine Ashford still commanded absolute authority over the household, a position she wielded like a weapon against the daughter-in-law she had never wanted. "That is untrue," Isabel said quietly, forcing her voice not to waver though her heart pounded violently against her ribs. "I have never met Lord Pembroke outside of public gatherings. You were seen." Lord Julian Ashford rose from his seat with practiced grace, his golden hair catching the firelight as he moved. The Duke's younger brother possessed the kind of easy charm that made him popular at every social gathering, his handsome face and ready smile concealing the ruthless ambition that drove him. At 31, he should have been content with the generous allowance his position afforded, but Isabel had long suspected that Julian resented every breath his older brother took. 3 days ago, entering the gardens behind the Pembroke estate, "The witness is unimpeachable." "Then your witness is mistaken," Isabel replied. "My mother's personal companion saw you with her own eyes," Julian continued smoothly, his voice carrying just the right note of pained reluctance, as though he hated having to expose her transgression. "She recognized your cloak, your carriage, even the arrangement of your hair." Isabel turned toward Sebastian, willing him to look at her, to see the truth written plainly in her face. But the Duke remained motionless, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the window where snow had begun to fall across the Thornfield estate in heavy, silent drifts. "Sebastian," she said, and hated how her voice broke on his name. "You know I would never—" "What I know," he interrupted, finally turning those cold blue eyes toward her, "is that you have given me no reason to trust you completely. We have been married 3 years, Isabel, 3 years during which you have kept yourself distant and secretive." Injustice of it stole her breath. She had been distant because his family made her existence a daily torture of subtle cruelties and deliberate humiliations. She had been secretive because every attempt at openness had been met with ridicule or manipulation by the woman who sat before her now radiating triumph. "I have been nothing but faithful to you and to this house," Isabel said, forcing strength into her voice. "Then explain why you left the estate 3 days ago without informing anyone of your destination," the Dowager Duchess demanded, leaning forward in her chair like a predator closing in for the kill. "Explain why you dismissed your lady's maid and traveled alone." Isabel felt the trap closing around her with the inevitability of a steel jaw snapping shut. She had left the estate that afternoon, yes. She had dismissed Margaret Hayes, her devoted lady's maid who had served her faithfully since her wedding day, asking the 35-year-old woman to remain behind while she made a private journey. She had gone to visit her younger sister who lived 2 hours away in a modest country house, responding to a desperate letter. Clara had been pregnant with her first child and suffering terribly, and Isabel had gone to comfort her, staying only a few hours before returning well before dinner. But Clara's husband was a gentleman of modest means, someone the Ashford family considered barely worthy of acknowledgement. Isabel had learned long ago not to mention her family in their presence. The Dowager Duchess had made it abundantly clear during the first month of marriage that Isabel's connections were an embarrassment to the Thornfield name, that her bloodline was acceptable but unremarkable, that she had been chosen for her reputation for propriety rather than any particular distinction. "I visited my sister," Isabel said carefully. "She was unwell and asked for my help." Julian laughed softly, the sound carrying perfectly calculated disbelief. "Your sister lives in the opposite direction from the Pembroke estate. Do not compound dishonesty with poor geography, dear sister." "I went to Clara's house," Isabel insisted, though she could see doubt flickering across Sebastian's face like shadows from the fireplace. "You may send word to her if you require proof." "Sister would lie to protect family," the Dowager Duchess said dismissively, waving one elegant hand as though brushing away an irritating insect. "What we require is an explanation for why Lady Thornbury saw you in Pembroke's gardens, wearing the distinctive blue cloak you ordered from London last month." "I was never in those gardens. I have never been to the Pembroke estate in my life." "You call my mother's companion a liar." Julian's voice carried just the right note of outraged nobility, the tone of a man defending an honorable woman's reputation against false accusations. Isabel looked again at Sebastian and found him watching her with an expression she could not read. 3 years of marriage and she still could not penetrate the walls he had built around himself after whatever tragedy had shaped him before their union. She had tried in the beginning, had offered him affection and partnership, and the promise of genuine companionship. He had accepted her with cold politeness and nothing more, maintaining a distance that felt more profound than mere physical separation. Now she wondered if he had ever intended to trust her at all, or if she had simply been chosen as a replacement for something he had lost and could never recover. "I call her mistaken," Isabel said carefully, aware that every word was being weighed and measured against her. "Perhaps she saw someone who resembled me. Perhaps the distance or the light played tricks on her perception." "Convenient," Julian murmured, returning to his seat with the satisfied air of a man who had made his point effectively. The Dowager Duchess rose from her seat with the regal bearing of a woman who had spent 40 years as the mistress of one of England's greatest estates. Her silver hair was arranged in the severe style she favored, and her cold gray eyes held the kind of authority that had made servants tremble and nobles defer to her judgment throughout her reign over Thornfield. "This family has endured enough scandal to last several generations," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute pronouncement. "Your behavior will be restricted until we determine the truth of this matter. You will not leave the estate under any circumstances. You will take your meals in your chambers rather than with the family, and you will speak to no one outside this household. Is that understood?" "You cannot imprison me in my own home," Isabel said, though she knew even as she spoke that they could do exactly that. A duchess had rights, yes, but a duchess accused of infidelity had far fewer, particularly when her husband chose not to defend her. "We can protect this family's reputation," the Dowager Duchess corrected sharply, "which you have endangered with your recklessness and impropriety. We are being more than generous in allowing you to remain under this roof while the matter is investigated." Isabel turned desperately toward Sebastian, her last hope for justice resting in the man who had sworn to honor and protect her 3 years ago in the chapel that stood at the edge of these very grounds. "Will you allow this? Will you condemn me without even investigating the truth of these accusations?" For a long moment that stretched into painful eternity, he said nothing. Snow continued to fall beyond the windows, already gathering in drifts against the ancient stone walls of the estate that had housed the Ashford family for 200 years. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, marking another moment of her life slipping away into uncertainty. Finally, Sebastian stood and walked toward the door with measured steps that spoke of rigid control. He did not look at her as he delivered his verdict. "Do as my mother instructs," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. until this matter is resolved to the family's satisfaction." He left the room without another word, and Isabel stood alone before her accusers, feeling the walls of her marriage crumbling around her like the ruins of some long-abandoned fortress. The Dowager Duchess smiled with cold satisfaction, and Julian watched her with eyes that held something she could not quite identify. Something that looked almost like anticipation. The next 2 days passed in suffocating isolation that felt more oppressive than any physical imprisonment. Isabel remained in her chambers as ordered, permitted to see only Margaret, who brought meals 3 times daily and whispered fragments of news from the household below in a voice barely audible above the crackling of the chamber fire. Margaret Hayes moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent her 35 years learning to be invisible when necessary and invaluable when called upon. She had been with Isabel since the wedding day, a gift from Isabel's mother who had insisted her daughter have at least one ally in the intimidating Thornfield household. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her loyalty had never wavered even when other servants had begun treating the Duchess with the subtle disdain that trickles down from the family above. "They are saying terrible things below stairs," Margaret told her quietly on the second evening while brushing out Isabel's chestnut hair with long, gentle strokes. "Lord Julian has been speaking to the other nobles who have come for the winter gathering. He suggests that your Grace has been conducting indiscretions for some time, that the Pembroke incident is merely the first one to come to light." "The Duke?" Isabel asked, watching Margaret's reflection in the mirror. Margaret hesitated, her hands pausing in their work. "His Grace has said nothing publicly to either condemn or defend you, but he has not contradicted the rumors either, and silence from a man of his position is often interpreted as confirmation." Isabel closed her eyes against the pain of that truth. She had known Sebastian was distant, had accepted that their marriage was one of duty rather than affection. But she had believed him to be fundamentally honorable, a man who valued truth and justice even if he could not offer love. She had believed that if she ever truly needed his protection, he would offer it without hesitation. Apparently she had been wrong about that as well. "There is something else," Margaret said carefully, resuming her brushing with hands that trembled slightly. "Something I hesitate to mention because it involves dangerous accusations." "Me everything," Isabel said, opening her eyes to meet her maid's gaze in the mirror. "I cannot defend myself against shadows and whispers. I need to understand what is truly happening. Witness who claims to have seen you at the Pembroke estate, Lady Thornbury." Margaret's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "She has been receiving payments from Lord Julian. Substantial ones, far more than any household expense would justify. I saw the records myself when I was in the steward's office delivering a message from the housekeeper." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. "Julian is paying her to lie about me." "I cannot prove what the payments are for," Margaret admitted, setting down the brush and meeting Isabel's eyes directly. "The entries in the household ledgers list them as miscellaneous expenses, but the amounts are significant and the timing is suspicious. The payments began a month ago, long before this accusation arose." A month ago, long enough to plan an elaborate deception with careful precision, long enough to manufacture evidence and arrange witnesses and construct a trap so perfectly designed that escape seemed impossible. "Why would he do this?" Isabel whispered, though even as she asked the question, she already knew the answer. Julian had always resented Sebastian's position as the elder son and heir. As the second-born, he received a generous allowance and a comfortable life, but no real power, no control over the vast Ashford estates and fortune. If Sebastian's marriage were to dissolve in scandal, if Isabel were sent away in disgrace, and the Duke left free to marry again, then Sebastian would need guidance on choosing a new wife. And who better to provide that guidance than his loyal younger brother? Or perhaps Julian's ambitions ran even darker than simple influence. Perhaps he had begun to imagine scenarios where Sebastian himself might be removed from the picture entirely, leaving the dukedom to pass to the next in line. "What should I do?" Isabel asked, feeling the weight of her powerlessness settle over her like a heavy cloak. Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "You should be very careful, Your Grace. Lord Julian is a dangerous man when he wants something, and he has proven willing to destroy reputations to achieve his goals. If he has gone this far, there is no telling what he might do next." The words sent a chill down Isabel's spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the chamber windows. The invitation came the next morning, delivered by a stone-faced footman who would not meet her eyes. Sebastian requested her presence in his study at 2 o'clock for a private conversation regarding the current situation. Isabel dressed with particular care, choosing a day gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the color of her hazel eyes and made her chestnut hair seem to glow in the winter light. If this was to be the conversation that ended her marriage, that sent her back to her family in disgrace, she would face it with every shred of dignity she could summon. The study was a thoroughly masculine room lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak furniture that spoke of generations of Ashford men conducting the business of their estates. Sebastian stood near the massive desk, still dressed in riding clothes that suggested he had spent the morning out on the grounds despite the continuing snow. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and she noticed with surprise that shadows bruised the skin beneath his piercing blue eyes. He looked tired, she realized. More than tired. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in days. "You wish to see me," she said when he did not speak, merely stood watching her with that unreadable expression that had frustrated her throughout their marriage. "Have been making inquiries," he said abruptly, his voice rougher than usual. "About your movements 3 days ago, about the accusations that have been made against you." Hope flickered in her chest like a candle flame struggling against the wind. "And what did you discover?" "Your sister confirms that you visited her that afternoon. She described your arrival time and your departure with enough specific detail that I believe her account is truthful." He paused, running one hand through his already disheveled hair. "The Pembroke estate lies 2 hours in the opposite direction from your sister's home. It would have been physically impossible for you to be in both places during the time frame in question." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she had to steady herself against the back of a nearby chair. "Then you know I was telling the truth. You know I never betrayed you." "I know you did not visit Lord Pembroke that afternoon," he corrected carefully. "That is not quite the same thing as trust, is it? Not the same as believing in your innocence without requiring investigation and proof." Words stung more than she expected, cutting through the relief to the deeper wound beneath. "What more do you want from me, Sebastian? I have been a faithful wife for 3 years. I have endured coldness from your family without complaint. I have asked for nothing but basic respect and consideration. What must I do to earn even a small measure of faith from you?" "You do not understand," he said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she heard something like genuine emotion in his voice. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "You cannot understand what it means to be betrayed by someone you trusted completely. Someone you gave your whole heart to only to have it destroyed." "Then explain it to me," Isabel said, moving closer despite her better judgment. "Tell me what happened to make you so certain that everyone around you is lying, that trust is impossible." He turned away from her, his broad shoulders rigid with tension as he stared at the shelves of books as though they held answers to questions he could not voice. "My first wife," he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him something. "Before you. The marriage that was never supposed to end." Isabel knew very little about Sebastian's first marriage. He never spoke of it, and the family maintained a careful silence on the subject, as though an agreement had been reached never to mention her name. Isabel knew only that his wife had died 5 years before she herself arrived at Thornfield, and that something about her death had changed Sebastian fundamentally, transforming him from whatever he had been into the cold, distant man who had spoken vows to her in the family chapel. "She was everything I believed a wife should be," Sebastian continued, his voice taking on a hollow quality. "Beautiful, graceful, devoted to our family and our position. Or so I thought." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I discovered 2 months before her death that she had been carrying on an affair with my closest friend for nearly a year. A man I had trusted like a brother, who dined at our table and rode across our lands and slept in chambers we provided. They had been deceiving me with extraordinary skill, meeting in secret and laughing at my ignorance. Sebastian, Isabel breathed, but he continued as though he had not heard her. She died in a carriage accident while traveling to meet him for one of their assignations. My friend was with her in the carriage. They both died when the horses panicked during a storm and the vehicle went off the road. His voice had gone completely flat now, drained of all emotion. I was left to manage the scandal as best I could, to protect what remained of the family name. My mother helped me bury the truth, ensured that the official story spoke only of a tragic accident during a charitable visit to a neighboring estate. But I swore I would never again trust blindly, never again give someone the power to destroy me so completely. Understanding crashed over Isabel like cold water, suddenly making sense of 3 years of careful distance and emotional walls. His coldness toward her was not about her at all. It was about a ghost, about a betrayal that still haunted him, about wounds that had never properly healed because he had never allowed them to. "I am not her," Isabel said quietly, with all the certainty she possessed. "I have never given you cause to doubt my faithfulness or my honor." "I know that intellectually," Sebastian said, finally turning to face her again. His blue eyes held a depth of pain that made her heart ache. "And yet I find myself unable to extend the faith you deserve. When Julian presented his evidence, when my mother's companion swore she had seen you in Pembroke's gardens, I wanted desperately to believe in your innocence. But all I could see was history repeating itself, another wife deceiving me while I remained blind to the truth." "Julian is lying," Isabel said with sudden fierce certainty. "The witness is lying. This entire accusation has been manufactured deliberately to destroy my reputation and undermine our marriage. Would my brother do such a thing?" Sebastian asked, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to consider the possibility seriously. "Because he wants what you have, because he believes he should be Duke of Thornfield instead of you." Isabel stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Because I am in his way. Margaret discovered that Julian has been paying Lady Thornbury substantial sums for the past month. Large payments with no documented purpose, hidden among routine household expenses. He planned this weeks in advance, Sebastian. He created false evidence specifically designed to turn you against me by exploiting your past pain." Sebastian's expression shifted dangerously, a cold fury entering his eyes that transformed his handsome features into something almost frightening. "You have proof of these payments." Margaret saw the records in Thomas Garrett's office. "Your steward would be able to confirm the entries if you asked him directly." Thomas Garrett had served the Ashford family for 20 years, rising from a junior clerk to the position of chief steward through a combination of sharp intelligence and absolute loyalty. At 42, he was one of the few people Sebastian trusted implicitly, a man who knew every detail of the estate's finances and operations. For a long moment, Sebastian said nothing, his mind clearly working through the implications of what she had told him. Then he moved toward the door with sudden decision, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "Wait here," he commanded, and disappeared into the corridor. He was gone for nearly 20 minutes that felt like hours. Isabel stood by the window watching snow continue to fall across the grounds, transforming the landscape into something beautiful and treacherous. When Sebastian finally returned, Thomas Garrett followed him, carrying a large leather-bound ledger under one arm. The steward's sharp eyes were troubled, and his usually composed expression had been replaced by something approaching anger. "Show her," Sebastian said without preamble. Thomas opened the ledger to a marked page and turned it toward Isabel on the desk. She leaned forward and saw the entries immediately, written in Julian's distinctive slanted hand. 5 payments to Lady Thornbury over the past month, each one substantial enough to change a gentlewoman's circumstances considerably, each one listed simply as household expenses with no further explanation. "Payments are listed as routine expenditures," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the precise tone of a man reporting facts he found distasteful. but I checked them against all household accounts and records of services provided. No corresponding goods were received. No services were rendered that would justify these amounts. The money went directly to Lady Thornbury for no documented legitimate reason. Could there be an innocent explanation? Isabel asked, though she already knew the answer from the grim set of Thomas's jaw. None that I can imagine, Your Grace, Thomas replied with the careful respect he had always shown her. Lord Julian has no authority to make such payments without the Duke's direct approval for amounts of this size. He deliberately hid these entries among routine expenditures, presumably hoping they would never be noticed or questioned during normal review. Sebastian's face had gone very cold, his features settling into an expression of controlled rage that made him look every inch the powerful Duke he was. "Where is my brother at this moment? He left the estate approximately an hour ago, Your Grace," Thomas reported. "He mentioned to the stable master that he was visiting friends in the village and would likely not return until late evening. Send riders immediately to find him and bring him back to the estate," Sebastian ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I do not care if you must search every building in the village. I want him found and returned here to answer for what he has done." Thomas bowed and departed swiftly, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Sebastian stood very still, his hands clenched so tightly that Isabel could see his knuckles had gone white. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet fury that was somehow more frightening than any shout would have been. "If he has done this," Sebastian said, each word carefully measured, "if he has deliberately tried to destroy your reputation and our marriage for his own advancement, I will see him ruined utterly. He will wish he had never been born into this family." "Is your brother," Isabel said carefully, uncertain whether she was trying to temper his rage or simply stating a fact that seemed important. "He is a traitor to this family and to everything we are supposed to represent," Sebastian corrected sharply. He turned toward her then, and she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Genuine guilt, real, painful remorse that seemed to age him years in an instant. "I have failed you catastrophically, Isabel. I allowed my past to poison my judgment. I gave him the opportunity to manipulate us both because I was too damaged to see clearly, too broken to recognize truth when it stood before me." "You were hurt," Isabel said quietly, understanding the distinction between explanation and excuse. "Betrayal leaves scars that do not heal easily." "That is no justification for treating you as I have," he said, crossing the room until he stood directly before her. This close, she could see every detail of his face, could read the genuine anguish in his blue eyes. "You deserved a husband who would defend you without hesitation, who would trust you implicitly, who would see your worth and cherish it. Instead, you received a man too broken to recognize the extraordinary gift he had been given, too afraid of being hurt again to allow himself to care." Isabel felt tears sting her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "I do not need poetry or grand declarations, Sebastian. I need only honesty between us, truth without walls or pretense. Then hear this truth, and know that I mean every word." He reached out slowly, as though afraid she might pull away, and took her hands gently in his own. His hands were warm and strong, and she realized with a start that this was the first time he had touched her with genuine tenderness since their wedding day. "I have spent 3 years keeping you at a careful distance because I was terrified, afraid that if I allowed myself to care for you, I would once again be destroyed when you inevitably betrayed me. But in my fear, I created the very loneliness I was trying to avoid. I pushed away the one person who might have brought me peace and healing, who might have helped me remember what it feels like to trust another human soul." "Can begin again," Isabel whispered, hardly daring to hope. "If you are truly willing to try, to let go of the past and build something real between us." "I want nothing more," Sebastian said with raw honesty. "But first I must deal with my brother and the damage he has tried to cause. I must make absolutely certain he can never threaten you or our marriage again." Julian did not return to the estate that night. As evening fell and the snow continued to accumulate in heavy drifts that made the roads increasingly treacherous, Sebastian grew visibly tense, packing the study like a caged predator. He sent riders to the village, to neighboring estates, to every place Julian might have gone. All returned hours later with the same report, their horses exhausted and their faces red with cold. No one had seen Lord Julian Ashford anywhere. "He knows," Thomas said quietly as he stood with Sebastian and Isabel in the study near midnight, the three of them gathered around the dying fire. "Somehow he discovered that you learned the truth about the payments, and he has fled rather than face the consequences of his actions." "Then we will find him," Sebastian said, his voice hard as steel. "We will search every inch of this county if necessary, and we will bring him back to answer for what he has done." But the next morning brought news that changed everything in ways none of them could have anticipated. Isabel was taking a late breakfast in her chambers, finally permitted to leave them now that her innocence had been established, when Margaret burst through the door without knocking. The lady's maid's face was white with shock, her usual composure completely shattered. "Your Grace," she gasped, her voice shaking. "There has been a terrible accident, a dreadful accident on the North Road." Isabel stood so quickly her chair toppled backward, clattering against the floor. "What happened? Tell me immediately." "A carriage went off the road last night during the height of the storm," Margaret said, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. "They found it this morning at the bottom of the ravine near the North Woods, completely destroyed. The Duke's personal traveling carriage, the one he uses when traveling in winter weather." Cold horror washed over Isabel in waves. "Was anyone injured?" "Was Sebastian. The Duke is safe. He never left the estate," Margaret interrupted quickly. "But the driver is badly injured and not expected to survive his wounds. He has been brought back to the estate and is asking desperately for the Duke, saying he has something urgent to confess before he dies." Margaret paused, her eyes wide with fear. "Your Grace, they found evidence in the wreckage that you were meant to be in that carriage. A travel case with your initials embroidered on it. A cloak that belongs to you. Items that would have identified you if the accident had been fatal." Isabel's mind raced through the implications. "I have not left the estate in days. I have been confined to these chambers by the Dowager Duchess's order." "Someone wanted it to appear as though you were traveling," Margaret said urgently, moving closer and lowering her voice even though they were alone. "Someone arranged for that carriage to go out during the storm with your belongings carefully placed inside, knowing it would crash. If you had actually been in it, you would certainly have died." Understanding struck Isabel like lightning, sudden and illuminating and terrible. "Julian wanted me dead. He arranged for the carriage to crash with me supposedly inside it, making it appear to be a tragic accident during the storm. That is why he disappeared yesterday so suddenly. He was not fleeing because he feared discovery of the payments. He was setting his final plan into motion, ensuring he would be far from the estate when the accident occurred." "The driver is begging to speak with the Duke," Margaret repeated, her hands twisting anxiously in her apron. "He says he must confess his sins before he meets his Maker." They found Sebastian already in the servants' quarters where the injured driver had been brought, laid out on a narrow bed in a small room near the kitchens. The estate physician, an elderly man who had served the family for decades, worked over him with quiet efficiency, but Isabel could read the prognosis in his grim expression and the way he had stopped trying to hide the extent of the injuries. The driver's name was Peter, and Isabel knew him as a decent man who had served the Ashford family faithfully for 15 years. He had driven her to her sister's house on dozens of occasions, always patient and respectful. Now he lay broken and dying, his face gray with pain and blood loss, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes found Sebastian as they entered, and relief flickered across his ravaged features. "Your Grace," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "Forgive me, please, I beg you to forgive me for what I have done." Sebastian knelt beside the narrow bed, his tall frame folding down so he could look directly into Peter's eyes. "Tell me what happened. Tell me everything, and I swear you will have whatever absolution I can offer." "Julian," Peter whispered, the name emerging with difficulty. "He came to me 3 days ago, in the stables where no one else could hear. He offered me £500 to arrange an accident with the Duchess's carriage. He said she would be traveling to visit her sister again, that she would be alone without her lady's maid." I was to drive her out during the next storm and overturn the carriage near the ravine on the north road. Make it look like the weather and the dangerous conditions caused the crash, nothing more. Isabel felt the room spinning around her, the full scope of Julian's plan becoming horrifyingly clear. Why did you agree? Sebastian's voice was deadly quiet, carefully controlled despite the rage she knew must be burning beneath the surface. Tears streamed down Peter's face, mixing with the blood. My daughter, Your Grace. My sweet Mary, only 8 years old. She fell ill last winter and has never recovered properly. The physicians say she needs special treatment, expensive medicine that we could never afford on my wages. Lord Julian knew this. He sought me out specifically because he knew I was desperate. His breathing rattled ominously. He said if I did this one thing, just this one terrible thing, he would pay for everything Mary needed. He would ensure she received the best medical care available. I would never have to watch my child suffer again. So you agreed to murder my wife, Sebastian said, each word precise and cutting. I agreed to save my daughter, Peter said brokenly. But when I took the carriage out last night, when I drove into the storm as Lord Julian instructed, the Duchess was not inside as he had promised. Just her belongings, her travel case and her cloak arranged on the seat. I realized then that he had lied about everything, that something was terribly wrong with what he was asking me to do. I tried to turn the horses back toward the estate, but they panicked in the wind and the snow. We went over the edge of the ravine before I could regain control. Where is Julian now? Sebastian demanded. Where did he say he would be? He told me he would be at the old hunting lodge on the eastern border of the estate, Peter said, gripping Sebastian's arm with what little strength remained to him. Waiting there to hear confirmation that the accident had occurred as planned. Your Grace, I am a dead man and I know this. The physician's face tells me everything I need to know about my fate. But please, I beg you, do not let my daughter suffer for my sins. She is innocent in all of this. Promise me she will be cared for. Your daughter will be provided for, Sebastian said quietly, his voice gentling slightly. You have my word as Duke of Thornfield. She will receive the medical treatment she needs and a generous pension that will ensure she never wants for anything. Your wife will be cared for as well. They will not pay the price for your mistake. Peter's eyes closed in relief so profound it seemed to drain the last of his strength. Thank you, Your Grace. May God forgive me for what I almost did. His breathing became more labored, each breath a struggle. The physician stepped forward and checked for a pulse, then after a long moment shook his head slowly. Peter had given his confession and received his absolution, and now he was gone. Sebastian stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury that made him look dangerous and powerful and utterly unforgiving. He turned toward Thomas, who had been standing silently near the door throughout the confession. Gather 10 men immediately, Sebastian ordered. We ride for the hunting lodge within the hour. Your Grace, the storm is getting worse, Thomas warned, glancing toward the window where wind drove snow against the glass in violent gusts. The roads will be extremely dangerous, perhaps impassable. I do not care if we have to ride through the gates of hell itself, Sebastian said, his voice carrying absolute determination. My brother tried to have my wife murdered. He will answer for this crime and he will answer today. I am coming with you, Isabel said firmly. Sebastian turned toward her, clearly prepared to argue, his protective instincts warring with his recognition that she had every right to confront the man who had tried to kill her. Then he stopped, perhaps seeing the determination in her face, perhaps finally understanding that she would not be left behind to wait and wonder while the men decided her fate. Well, he said after a long pause, but you stay close to me at all times. I will not risk losing you when we have only just found each other. They rode out into the storm less than an hour later, 12 riders total including Sebastian, Isabel, Thomas, and 9 of the most trusted men from the estate. The wind cut through their heavy cloaks like knives, and the snow fell so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The horses struggled through drifts that grew deeper with every passing mile. Isabel rode beside Sebastian on a steady mare that had been chosen for her reliability rather than speed. Her body grew numb with cold despite the layers of wool and fur she wore, but her mind burned with a fury that kept her focused and alert. Julian had tried to kill her, had paid a desperate man to stage her death and make it appear an unfortunate accident during dangerous weather. And when Peter had failed to follow through with the actual murder, when the driver had gone over the ravine without her inside the carriage, Julian had simply disappeared to his prearranged hiding place to wait for confirmation of her death. What had he planned to do when news reached him? Return to the estate and express appropriate grief at his sister-in-law's tragic passing, console his devastated brother while secretly celebrating the removal of the obstacle between himself and greater influence. Perhaps begin suggesting suitable candidates for Sebastian's next marriage, women who could be controlled and manipulated to Julian's purposes. The hunting lodge finally appeared through the driving snow after 2 brutal hours of riding, a dark shape against the white landscape. It was a substantial building despite its name, large enough to house hunting parties of a dozen nobles in comfortable style during the autumn season. Lights showed in several windows, confirming that someone had indeed taken refuge there. Sebastian dismounted and signaled for the others to surround the building, cutting off any possible escape routes. Then he walked directly to the front door and threw it open without bothering to knock, entering with the absolute authority of a man on his own property confronting a trespasser. Julian stood near the large stone fireplace in the main hall, a glass of expensive wine in his hand, and a book lying open on the table beside him. He had clearly been passing the time in comfort while waiting for news of Isabel's death. He turned at the violent intrusion, his handsome face shifting from surprise to careful calculation in the space of a single heartbeat. "Brother," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just the right note of pleased surprise. "What brings you all the way out here in such dreadful weather? I had thought to wait out the storm before returning to the estate." "Peter is dead," Sebastian said flatly, snow still dusting his dark hair and shoulders. But before he died, he confessed everything. Julian's mask of pleasant civility cracked for just an instant, genuine fear flickering across his features before he managed to control his expression. Then he smiled, cold and sharp as a blade. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, Sebastian. Has the old man been telling wild stories? You know how servants can become confused when they are injured or in pain. You paid him £500 to murder my wife by staging a carriage accident during this storm," Sebastian said, his voice carrying such controlled fury that even Julian took an involuntary step backward. "You arranged for Isabel's belongings to be placed in the carriage to identify her body after the crash. You manufactured the entire affair accusation specifically to make her death seem less suspicious, to create a narrative where a disgraced duchess might have been fleeing the estate when tragedy struck." "That is an extraordinary accusation," Julian said, though his eyes had begun darting toward the doors and windows, calculating possible escape routes. "One you cannot possibly prove with any legitimate evidence." "I have Peter's dying confession, witnessed by the estate physician, the chief steward, and my wife herself," Sebastian countered. "I have the ledgers showing your unauthorized payments to Lady Thornbury to provide false testimony. I have documentation of every step of your plan to destroy Isabel's reputation and then her life. I have more than enough evidence to see you charged with attempted murder and conspiracy." Julian set down his wine glass with careful precision, his facade of innocence finally crumbling to reveal the calculating ambition beneath. "You would actually destroy your own brother over a woman you barely know, over a wife you have ignored for 3 years. "I would destroy anyone who threatens my wife," Sebastian said, and there was such absolute certainty in his voice that the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "You are no longer my brother, Julian. You are a criminal and a traitor to everything this family represents." "The dukedom should have been mine by rights," Julian said, and all pretense of civility vanished from his face, replaced by naked resentment that had clearly been festering for years. "I am the better man in every way that matters. Smarter, more charming, more capable of managing the complex political alliances that maintain our position in society. But I was born second, 3 minutes after you emerged into the world, so I receive nothing while you inherit an empire. The entire system is fundamentally unjust. So you decided to murder an innocent woman to remedy this injustice? Isabel asked, stepping forward from where she had been standing slightly behind Sebastian. Her voice was steady despite the rage and fear churning inside her. Julian's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, genuine hatred burning in their depths. You meant nothing. A minor noblewoman with mediocre family connections and no particular value beyond a reputation for propriety. Your death would have been unfortunate but ultimately insignificant in the greater scope of things. Sebastian would have mourned appropriately for a few months and then remarried someone I selected. Someone who understood how power truly works, who would have been willing to work with me rather than against me. Someone you could control completely, Isabel said quietly. Someone who would have helped you manipulate Sebastian until you had effective power over the entire dukedom while he remained the public face of authority. Exactly, Julian said, his smile returning but twisted now with bitterness. But you survived, and now here we are. You think you have won something, but you are wrong about that. Sebastian can never truly trust you or anyone else. His first wife destroyed that capacity in him forever. You will spend the rest of your life married to a ghost, to the memory of her betrayal, and the walls he built to protect himself from ever being hurt again. That fate is arguably worse than any death I could have given you. You know nothing about what I am capable of feeling, Sebastian said coldly. And you will have no opportunity to discover the truth because you will be gone from England entirely by this time tomorrow. You cannot seriously believe you can exile me, Julian said, but genuine fear had entered his voice now. As Duke of Thornfield and head of this family, I have exactly that authority, Sebastian replied. You will leave tomorrow morning for the continent. France or Italy, I care not which. You will receive a modest allowance, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly. And if you ever attempt to contact anyone in this family again, if you ever set foot on English soil, I will use every resource at my disposal to see you formally charged with attempted murder and imprisoned for the rest of your natural life. This is outrageous, Julian protested. I am your brother. We share blood and history and we share nothing anymore, Sebastian interrupted, his voice final as a death sentence. You tried to kill my wife, Julian. The only reason you are not hanging from a gallows at this very moment is the accident of your birth and my desire to spare our mother the public shame of seeing her younger son executed for murder. But that protection has very definite limits. Accept banishment with what grace you can manage, or face formal charges and a public trial. Choose now, because I will not offer this mercy a second time. For a long moment, Julian stood frozen, calculation warring with desperation in his eyes as he tried to find some way out of the trap that had closed around him. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining out of him as he realized Sebastian would not be swayed. I will need time to make proper arrangements, he said bitterly, grasping at whatever small dignities remained available to him. You have until dawn tomorrow morning, Sebastian said flatly. Pack what you can carry in a single trunk and be ready to depart. A carriage will take you to the coast where passage has already been arranged on a ship leaving for Calais. If you are still on this estate when the sun rises fully, I will have you arrested and charged immediately. Julian looked at Isabel then, and the hatred blazing in his eyes was so intense she felt it like a physical force. You have won nothing, he repeated quietly, his voice carrying venom. A man who cannot trust will never truly love. You will spend your entire life married to Sebastian's fear and damage, forever kept at arm's length by ghosts you cannot fight. That is a fate worse than any death I could have arranged for you. Then he walked past them toward the door, his defeat absolute but his spite still finding ways to wound. The men who had surrounded the building parted to let him through, and he disappeared into the storm without looking back. Sebastian stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the fire as though searching for answers in the flames. Then he turned toward Isabel, and she saw exhaustion and relief and something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. It is finished, he said quietly. Is it? She asked. Julian's final words still echoing in her mind. The journey back to the estate was quieter despite the continuing storm. the tension that had driven them forward now replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Snow had begun to ease slightly as dawn approached, and by the time they rode through the estate gates, the sky had lightened to gray. Isabel's entire body ached with cold and exhaustion, but her mind would not stop turning over everything that had happened. Julian's accusations, his final curse about Sebastian's inability to trust and love. Were his words true? Had they simply traded one form of misery for another? As they dismounted in the courtyard, Sebastian reached across the small distance between them and caught her hand in his. "Come with me," he said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue but carrying an undertone of determination. He led her not to the main house where warmth and rest waited, but across the snowy grounds to the small stone chapel that stood at the edge of the formal gardens. Inside, candles had been lit by some servant preparing for morning prayers, their flames flickering in the pre-dawn darkness and illuminating the simple beauty of the sacred space. "I brought you here on the day we married," Sebastian said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet. "Do you remember? You showed me where your family has been buried for generations," Isabel said, the memory still vivid despite 3 years having passed. "You showed me where your first wife rests, and you told me you could offer me respect and position but never love. I told you that part of me had died with her betrayal and would never return," Sebastian continued, still holding her hand as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. "I said I could be a faithful husband and a respectful partner, but that I would never again give anyone access to my heart." "I remember every word," Isabel said quietly, the pain of that conversation still carrying a sharp edge. Sebastian turned to face her fully, and she saw that his piercing blue eyes were bright with tears he was no longer trying to hide. "I was wrong about everything, Isabel. Not dead, merely sleeping. Not destroyed, merely hidden away where it could not be hurt again. My heart was waiting for someone brave enough and patient enough to endure the winter until spring could finally return." "Sebastian," she began, but he gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Please let me finish before I lose courage," he said, and she could hear the emotion making his voice tremble slightly. "Tonight I rode through a blizzard to protect you, and I would have ridden through far worse if necessary. Not because duty required it, but because the thought of losing you was more than I could bear. The idea that Julian might have succeeded, that you might have died in that carriage believing I did not care for you, was agony beyond anything I have ever experienced." "What are you saying?" Isabel whispered, hardly daring to hope. "That Julian was completely wrong in his final accusation," Sebastian said fiercely, both hands now gripping hers as though she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "I can love, Isabel. I do love. Somewhere during these 3 years of distance and coldness, you became absolutely essential to my existence. I did not realize it until the moment I thought I might lose you, but it has been growing all along. Every time you bore my family's cruelty with grace. Every time you offered kindness to servants who did not deserve it. Every time you looked at me with those beautiful hazel eyes, and I saw patience and hope despite having every reason to feel neither." Tears were streaming down Isabel's face now, 3 years of loneliness and longing finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "I fell in love with you during our wedding ceremony," she confessed, her voice breaking. "When you spoke your vows, there was something in your voice that gave me hope that perhaps we might build something real together. But then you locked yourself away from me, and I thought I had imagined it, that I had invented feelings that were never there." "You did not imagine anything," Sebastian said, reaching up to gently wipe away her tears with his thumbs. "I felt it too, that spark of possibility, but I was so terrified of being hurt again that I retreated immediately, like the coward I have been. I convinced myself that distance would protect me, that if I never allowed myself to care then, I could never be destroyed. But all I accomplished was creating a different kind of destruction. I nearly lost the most precious thing in my life because I was too damaged to recognize its value." "Have time now," Isabel said, leaning into his touch. "Julian is gone. The threat is ended. We can begin our marriage properly without walls or pretense." "I want nothing more than that," Sebastian said. "But first I need you to understand something important. I am not healed, Isabel. The wounds from my first marriage still exist, and there will be moments when my old fears resurface. I may struggle with trust even though you have never given me reason to doubt. I may pull away when I should move closer. I am damaged in ways that will take years to fully overcome. Then we will work through it together, Isabel said firmly. I do not expect perfection, Sebastian. I expect only honesty and effort, the willingness to try, even when it is difficult. He pulled her close then and kissed her with a tenderness and passion that stole her breath away. It was not their first kiss. They had exchanged the required kiss during their wedding ceremony and a handful of perfunctory kisses in the 3 years since. But this felt entirely different. This felt like a true beginning, like the start of something real and deep and worth fighting for. When they finally parted, dawn had begun to break through the chapel windows in earnest, painting everything in shades of gold and rose that transformed the simple space into something magical. What happens now? Isabel asked, still safe in the circle of his arms. Now we begin our marriage properly, Sebastian said, and the smile that crossed his face held more genuine warmth than she had ever seen from him. No more distance between us, no more walls built from fear and old pain, just two people learning to trust each other completely, to build something lasting together. That will take considerable time and patience, Isabel warned, though her own smile matched his. Then it is fortunate we have the rest of our lives, Sebastian replied, tucking a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. Outside the chapel, the snow had finally stopped falling entirely, leaving the world clean and new and sparkling in the early morning light. Julian would be gone by full sunrise, banished to the continent to live out his days far from England and the family he had betrayed. The Dowager Duchess would have to accept that Isabel was not only staying, but had proven herself innocent of all accusations. The household would slowly learn that their Duke and Duchess were building a true partnership rather than maintaining a polite fiction. And somewhere in the great estate of Thornfield, a marriage that had been slowly dying of neglect and fear would finally have the chance to bloom into something extraordinary. Isabel leaned against her husband's shoulder and looked toward the rising sun, feeling hope kindle in her chest for the first time in 3 years. "Thank you for finding your way back to me," she said softly. Sebastian pressed a lingering kiss to her temple, his arms tightening around her as though he never intended to let her go. "Thank you for waiting, for refusing to give up even when I gave you every reason to do so. You are the bravest person I have ever known." In the quiet of the chapel, surrounded by the memories of generations past, but looking firmly toward the future, the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield began again. Not as strangers bound by duty and social expectation, but as partners bound by something far more powerful and enduring, love that had survived betrayal and manipulation and winter storms. Love that had been tested by false accusations and murder plots and family treachery. Love that had proven itself worthy of fighting for, worthy of protecting, worthy of every difficult moment of the long journey that had brought them to this perfect morning. And in that sacred moment, Isabel knew with absolute certainty that Julian's final curse had been nothing but empty spite. Sebastian could love, and he did love her. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in his touch, hear it in every word he spoke. The storms had finally passed. Winter was ending at last. And spring had come to Thornfield, bringing with it the promise of new growth and healing, and a future bright with possibility. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and redemption set in Victorian England, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more historical romance stories, and leave a comment below telling us what you thought of the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield's journey. What would you like to see in the next story? Let us know in the comment section.